May 14, 1943, 14,000 feet over the Russell Islands. Second Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh watched his section leader's F4U Corsair disintegrate under cannon fire from a Mitsubishi Zero. The Japanese pilot had turned inside Walsh's formation with impossible tightness, achieving firing position in less than 8 seconds. Now that same Zero was sliding onto Walsh's tail, and every defensive maneuver Walsh had learned at Pensacola was about to get him killed. Walsh broke hard right. Standard doctrine, maximum deflection turn to force an overshoot. The Zero turned harder. Walsh reversed left, hoping to catch the Japanese pilot committed to the wrong direction. The Zero reversed faster. Walsh's airspeed was bleeding away. At 210 miles per hour, his Corsair's turn rate peaked. The Zero could sustain this rate at 170 miles per hour, giving its pilot all the time needed to refine his gun solution. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Walsh had perhaps 3 seconds before 20mm shells tore through his aircraft. His instrument panel showed airspeed dropping through 200 miles per hour. His wingman was gone, either dead or separated in the chaos. The radio crackled with urgent warnings from other pilots in similar death spirals. Everything Walsh had been taught about defensive flying had failed. The Zero pilot owned this fight. What Walsh did next violated every principle drilled into him during training. He shoved his stick forward and hard right simultaneously, rolling his Corsair inverted while pushing negative G forces that sent blood rushing to his head. His vision went crimson at the edges. The world spun sickeningly as his aircraft rolled through 180 degrees and began accelerating downward. But instead of diving away from the threat like every instinct demanded, Walsh kept rolling, past inverted. Through 270 degrees, approaching a full 360-degree rolling dive at continuously increasing speed. The Zero pilot, expecting Walsh to either continue turning horizontally or dive away inverted, found himself staring at an empty piece of sky. Walsh's Corsair had traced a corkscrew path through 3-dimensional space that consumed altitude but generated tremendous speed. By the time Walsh rolled wings level at 8,000 feet, his airspeed indicator showed 410 miles per hour. The Zero was 3,000 feet above him, unable to follow through the maneuver, completely out of position. Walsh had survived. More importantly, he had stumbled onto a tactic that would transform how American naval aviators fought in the Pacific. Within 6 months, this rolling escape maneuver would be taught to every Corsair pilot in the theater, and the kill ratios that had favored Japanese pilots would reverse entirely. This wasn't the clean, procedural combat that appeared in training films or official doctrine. This was raw physics, meeting desperate innovation, where pilots discovered their bodies could endure physiological extremes that aviation medicine insisted were impossible, and where the very characteristics that made the Corsair difficult to fly from carrier decks, its weight, its power, its tendency toward instability, became survival advantages in the vertical dimension. The Vought F4U Corsair entered combat operations in February 1943, with a reputation that terrified American pilots almost as much as it concerned the enemy. The aircraft killed students during training at an alarming rate. Its long nose blocked forward visibility during landing approaches. Its left wing stalled before the right, creating violent snap rolls that had killed dozens of pilots. The landing gear oleo struts bounced unpredictably during carrier touchdowns. Naval aviators called it the Ensign Eliminator. Some carrier commanders refused to operate the type from their flight decks entirely. Yet the same characteristics that made the Corsair dangerous during routine operations gave it unprecedented capabilities in combat. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine developed 2,000 horsepower at takeoff, 2,250 horsepower with water injection for combat emergencies. This massive radial engine, the most powerful fitted to any single-seat fighter in American service, gave the Corsair a power-to-weight ratio that exceeded every Japanese fighter then operational. The aircraft's empty weight was 8,822 pounds. Maximum loaded weight reached 14,000 pounds with full internal fuel, ammunition, and external stores. This mass, combined with exceptional engine power, created unique performance characteristics. The Corsair could dive faster than any Japanese fighter. Its terminal velocity in a straight vertical dive exceeded 500 miles per hour. The Zero's maximum dive speed was approximately 410 miles per hour, limited by structural considerations. The Corsair's airframe was stressed to positive 7.5 G and negative 3 G, reflecting robust construction using heavy-gauge aluminum and reinforced attachment points. But it was in rolling performance where the Corsair revealed advantages that pilots initially failed to recognize. The aircraft's ailerons remained effective at speeds where other fighters experienced control stiffening. At 400 miles per hour, a Zero's ailerons became almost immovable, requiring both hands and considerable strength to achieve even modest roll rates. The Corsair's ailerons at that same speed could roll the aircraft at nearly 90 degrees per second. This differential became tactically decisive. When Marine Fighting Squadron 124 deployed to Guadalcanal in February 1943, its pilots carried doctrine developed for earlier, slower fighters. The official tactical guidance emphasized altitude advantage, coordinated attacks, and disciplined flight integrity. Defensive maneuvers focused on using superior diving speed to escape after making attacking passes. Turn fighting was strictly prohibited. Zeros could outturn any American fighter in horizontal combat, so horizontal combat was to be avoided entirely. This doctrine worked adequately when American pilots maintained perfect discipline and when combat unfolded according to plan. Neither condition held reliably in actual operations. Pilots became separated from their formations. Zeros appeared from unexpected directions. Initial attacks failed to destroy targets, forcing pilots into extended engagements. Japanese pilots, veterans of combat operations dating back to 1937 over China, knew exactly how to force American fighters into situations where doctrine failed and desperation began. The standard Japanese tactical response to American diving attacks involved immediate, hard turns. When a Corsair or Wildcat dove on a Zero formation, Japanese pilots didn't attempt to run. They turned toward the threat, forcing the attacking American to either pull out of his dive without firing or commit to a turning engagement. If the American pulled out without engaging, the Zero pilots maintained formation integrity and mission focus. If the American committed to the turn, he died, because no American fighter could sustain turning combat against a Zero and survive. A second Japanese tactic involved pairs of fighters working in coordination. One Zero would fly as bait, maintaining steady course and altitude, appearing vulnerable. When an American pilot committed to attack the bait Zero, its partner, positioned several thousand feet higher and offset, would dive on the American during his attack run. The American pilot would suddenly find himself defensive, with a Zero on his tail in a firing position, and defensive meant turning, which meant entering combat geometry that favored the Japanese aircraft overwhelmingly. Marine pilots in VMF 124 learned these lessons through brutal experience during their first weeks at Guadalcanal. 8 pilots were killed in the squadron's initial encounters. After action, debriefings revealed a consistent pattern. Pilots were dying in turning engagements they could not avoid. The official doctrine of refusing to turn fight worked only when pilots had unlimited altitude and perfect situational awareness. Real combat provided neither luxury consistently. Major Gregory Boyington, who would later earn the Medal of Honor and command the famous Black Sheep Squadron, flew with VMF 122 during this period. His after-action reports from April and May 1943 noted repeatedly that Zeros were forcing American pilots into extended turning fights regardless of doctrine. Boyington emphasized that pilots needed tactics that worked after the initial diving attack failed, not before it succeeded. The physical characteristics of turning combat created mathematics that no amount of skill or courage could overcome. Turn radius depends on velocity and G-force loading. The Zero's empty weight of 3,704 pounds and wing area of 241.5 square feet produced wing loading of only 15.3 pounds per square foot. The Corsair's wing loading was 34.2 pounds per square foot. In practical terms, at combat speeds around 200 miles per hour, a Zero could sustain a turn radius of approximately 750 feet. The Corsair at the same speed needed roughly 1,300 feet. In a horizontal turning fight, the Zero pilot could simply circle inside the Corsair's turn, maintaining his position advantage indefinitely, while his opponent bled energy and became progressively more vulnerable. The Corsair pilot's only option was to reverse course, diving away to use superior speed for escape. But diving away meant giving up altitude, the most precious commodity in air combat, and Japanese pilots quickly learned to position themselves to attack Americans during these predictable escape dives. The rolling escape maneuver that Walsh discovered accidentally in May 1943 represented a solution that exploited the Corsair's strengths rather than accepting combat on the Zero's terms. The physics involved several interconnected advantages. First, the maneuver traded altitude for energy rapidly. A Corsair in a rolling dive could accelerate from 200 miles per hour to over 400 miles per hour within 4,000 feet of altitude loss. This acceleration rate exceeded what a Zero could achieve following the same flight path. Second, the continuous rolling motion during the dive forced a pursuing Zero pilot to match both the vertical descent and the lateral displacement. The Zero's roll rate at high speed was substantially slower than the Corsair's. At 300 miles per hour, a Zero required approximately 4 seconds to complete a full 360-degree roll. The Corsair at the same speed could roll in less than 2.5 seconds. This difference meant that a Zero pilot attempting to follow a Corsair through a sustained rolling dive would quickly lose sight of his target as the American aircraft spiraled away faster than the Zero could match. Third, and perhaps most critically, the maneuver placed enormous stress on pursuing aircraft and pilots. Sustaining a rolling dive while attempting to track a target and maintain gun solution required continuous negative and positive G transitions that induced severe spatial disorientation. The Zero's lighter construction made sustained high-speed maneuvering structurally risky. Several documented incidents from mid-1943 describe Zero pilots who attempted to follow Corsairs through rolling dives and experienced control surface flutter or wing failure when speeds exceeded 420 miles per hour. The human physiological costs were equally significant. During a properly executed rolling escape, a Corsair pilot experienced alternating positive and negative G forces as his aircraft spiraled downward. Each roll through inverted flight produced momentary negative G, perhaps -1 to -2 G, sufficient to cause blood pressure increases in the head, but not severe enough to induce complete red-out. The continuous rolling motion prevented sustained G exposure in any single direction, actually reducing the physiological impact compared to a simple inverted dive. For the pursuing Zero pilot, the situation was worse. Attempting to track a spiraling target while matching its three-dimensional flight path required constant stick and rudder inputs. The pilot experienced disorienting G transitions while simultaneously trying to maintain visual contact, compute lead angles, and avoid overstressing his airframe. Most Japanese pilots abandoned pursuit after 2 or 3 rolls, unable to maintain effective tracking. Kenneth Walsh didn't immediately recognize the significance of what he'd done. His after-action report from May 14th described the maneuver as rolling away, inverted and diving, with notation that the Zero did not follow. Squadron intelligence officers, focused on compiling kill claims and loss statistics, filed the report without special emphasis. Walsh himself was more concerned with the death of his section leader than with analyzing unusual defensive tactics. But other pilots in VMF 124 had witnessed Walsh's escape. During the evening debrief that night, several pilots questioned Walsh about the maneuver. How fast were you going when you rolled? How many rolls did you make? Could you see the Zero during the dive? Walsh answered as best he could, admitting that much of the maneuver had been instinctive rather than planned. He remembered shoving stick forward and right simultaneously. He remembered the world spinning and his vision going red. He remembered checking his airspeed at 8,000 feet and being shocked to see over 400 miles per hour indicated. First Lieutenant Robert Hansen, Walsh's wingman on subsequent missions, asked to try the maneuver during a training flight the following week. With Walsh flying chase, Hansen rolled his Corsair into a sustained spiral dive from 12,000 feet. Walsh followed at a distance, observing. Hansen completed 6 full rolls during the descent, leveling at 4,000 feet with his airspeed exceeding 420 miles per hour. The entire maneuver consumed approximately 20 seconds and 4,000 feet of altitude. After landing, Hansen reported experiencing disorientation during the middle of the dive, when his visual references became confused, but his instruments remained readable throughout, and his aircraft responded normally to control inputs. The physiological effects were described as intense but manageable, a crushing sensation during the negative G phases, followed by heavy feeling during positive G phases, creating a rhythmic stress that was unpleasant but not incapacitating. Within days, multiple pilots in VMF 124 were practicing the rolling escape maneuver during training flights. The technique spread informally, pilot to pilot, without official endorsement or documentation. Squadron Commander Major Robert Gaylor neither prohibited nor formally authorized the practice. He recognized that his pilots were developing solutions to tactical problems that official doctrine had not addressed, but he also understood that documenting unauthorized training could create liability issues if pilots were killed attempting the maneuver. The informal instruction emphasized several key points. First, never initiate the maneuver below 8,000 feet. The dive consumed altitude rapidly, and pilots needed adequate margin for recovery. At lower altitudes, traditional diving escapes were safer, even if less effective. Second, roll into the pose. Maneuver aggressively. Hesitant control inputs produced slower rolls that allowed pursuing Zeros to maintain visual tracking. Decisive, forceful stick movements generated roll rates that broke the tracking solution immediately. Third, maintain back pressure throughout the dive to prevent the aircraft from entering a pure vertical dive. The goal was a spiral descent, not a straight-down plummet. The spiral path generated lateral displacement that made tracking difficult, while the descending flight path built energy. Fourth, monitor airspeed continuously and begin recovery before reaching structural limits. The Corsair could survive dives to 500 miles per hour, but control forces became very heavy above 450 miles per hour, requiring strong pull on the stick to recover. Fifth, use the energy advantage after recovery. The maneuver wasn't complete when the pilot leveled his wings. At 400 miles per hour, the Corsair had enormous kinetic energy that could be converted back into altitude through a zoom climb, or used to extend away from the combat area at high speed. The worst outcome was completing the escape dive, then flying straight and level at low altitude where Zeros could catch up. The first documented case of the rolling escape maneuver being used deliberately rather than instinctively occurred on June 9, 1943, during a fighter sweep over New Georgia. Captain Harold Spears led 4 Corsairs on patrol at 16,000 feet when they encountered 12 Zeros climbing to intercept. Spears initiated a diving attack according to standard doctrine, achieved 1 probable kill during his initial pass, then found himself in a turning engagement with 3 Zeros when he tried to climb back to altitude. 1 Zero achieved a tail position on Spears. His wingman called urgent warnings but was too far away to help. Spears, remembering Walsh's maneuver from weeks earlier, shoved his stick forward and right. His Corsair rolled, inverted, then continued rolling as it dove. Spears counted 4 complete rolls before leveling at 9,000 feet. The pursuing Zero had fallen behind and above, unable to match Spears's descent rate or lateral movement. Spears used his speed advantage to extend horizontally, separating from the enemy fighters, then climbed back to join his formation. Spears's gun camera was running during the entire sequence, providing the first visual documentation of the rolling escape tactic. The footage showed the Zero clearly positioned for a killing shot before Spears rolled. Then the camera view spiraled sickeningly as Spears's aircraft corkscrewed downward. When the image stabilized, the Zero was no longer visible. Squadron intelligence officers reviewing the footage recognized immediately that this represented a reliable defensive tactic, not a lucky accident. By July 1943, the rolling escape maneuver had spread to other Corsair squadrons operating from Guadalcanal, the Russell Islands, and New Georgia. VMF 121, VMF 123, and VMF 213 all included informal instruction on the technique during pilot briefings. If you find this story engaging, Please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The language varied, but the concept remained consistent. When a Zero gets on your tail in a position where you can't shake him with horizontal maneuvers, roll into a spiral dive, build speed, and use that energy to separate or counterattack. The tactic remained unofficial throughout 1943. No training manual described it. No tactical directive from Marine Aircraft Group authorized it. The technique existed in the collective knowledge of combat pilots, transmitted through word of mouth and demonstration flights. When replacement pilots arrived from the United States, they received informal briefings from squadron veterans during their first days in theater. The instruction was simple and direct. Here's how to stay alive when a Zero gets behind you. What made the rolling escape particularly effective was that it reversed the typical engagement sequence. Japanese tactical doctrine assumed that American fighters would either attempt to outturn Zeros, which was impossible, or dive away in straight lines, which was predictable. The rolling dive was neither. It combined aspects of both vertical and horizontal maneuver in a three-dimensional spiral that Japanese pilots had not encountered and could not easily counter. Japanese pilots eventually recognized this new American tactic and attempted to develop responses. Combat reports from Zero pilots in mid to late 1943 mentioned American fighters that spiraled away while diving or rolled continuously during escape. Initial Japanese assessments viewed this as evidence that American pilots had developed superior aerobatic skills. This interpretation was partly correct, but missed the fundamental point. The maneuver didn't require exceptional aerobatic ability. It required understanding how to use the Corsair's specific characteristics, its power, its roll rate, its structural strength, against the Zero's limitations. Some Japanese pilots attempted to follow Corsairs through rolling dives with fatal results. The Zero's airframe, optimized for turning performance through lightweight construction, had reduced structural margins at high speeds. Several documented incidents from late 1943 describe Zero pilots who experienced catastrophic airframe failure while attempting high-speed rolling maneuvers. The wings, lacking the heavy spar reinforcement common in American fighters, developed flutter at speeds above 400 miles per hour. Control surfaces became ineffective or detached entirely. Some pilots survived by abandoning their aircraft. Others died in the resulting crashes. The Nakajima Sakae engine, powering most Zero variants, also suffered problems during sustained high-speed flight. The engine was fuel-injected, unlike some earlier Japanese designs, but its cooling system struggled to dissipate heat generated during prolonged high-power operation. Zeros attempting to maintain speed while following Corsairs through extended diving maneuvers frequently experienced cylinder head overheating, leading to power loss at critical moments. When engine power failed mid-dive while a pilot was inverted or in unusual attitudes, recovery became extremely difficult. Japanese training programs could not adapt quickly enough to address these tactical developments. By late 1943, Japan was losing experienced pilots faster than replacement training could provide new aviators with equivalent skill levels. The training curriculum emphasized traditional dogfighting techniques that had proven effective in China and during the war's early years. There was insufficient time, fuel, or instructor availability to teach advanced energy management or three-dimensional maneuvering. New Japanese pilots, arriving in the Solomon Islands theater in late 1943 and early 1944, often had fewer than 300 hours total flight time, with minimal gunnery training and almost no exposure to American tactical methods. These pilots faced American Marines with increasing combat experience, flying aircraft that had overcome their initial operational difficulties, supported by improving logistics and maintenance. The qualitative balance that had favored Japanese pilots in 1942 had reversed entirely by mid-1944. Kenneth Walsh became the Marine Corps' first Corsair ace on August 15, 1943, achieving his fifth confirmed victory during combat over Vella La Vella. His tactical approach had evolved significantly from his early encounters. Walsh now used the rolling escape maneuver not just defensively, but as part of an offensive sequence. He would initiate combat with high-speed diving attacks and if Zeros attempted to engage him during his pullout, he would roll into a spiral dive, build speed, separation, then reverse course, and climb back into the fight from an unexpected angle. This aggressive application of the rolling tactic transformed it from pure defensive escape into a reset mechanism that allowed Corsair pilots to dictate engagement geometry. Walsh described his approach in a letter to his wife in September 1943. "The Zero boys try to turn with me, and I let them think they're getting close. Then I roll out and dive away before they can shoot. By the time they figure out where I went, I'm already climbing back up behind them with more speed than they can match. They're good pilots, but their plane can't follow mine through the vertical." Walsh's success attracted attention from higher command. By October 1943, he had accumulated 20 confirmed victories, making him one of the leading American aces in the Pacific. His after-action reports consistently mentioned the rolling dive tactic. Marine Corps aviation leadership, reviewing these reports, began to recognize that combat pilots had developed solutions to tactical problems that official doctrine had not addressed. In November 1943, the Marine Corps issued updated tactical guidance that, for the first time, officially acknowledged vertical maneuvering as acceptable defensive tactics for Corsair pilots. The language was cautious, noting that spiral diving maneuvers may be employed when conventional escape methods prove inadequate, and emphasizing altitude minimums and structural speed limits. But the guidance represented official recognition that combat innovation had outpaced formal doctrine. The Corsair's reputation within the Marine Corps began to shift during this period. The aircraft that had been feared during training because of its difficult handling characteristics was now respected in combat for those same characteristics. Its weight became an advantage in dives. Its powerful engine provided energy that lighter fighters couldn't match. Its tendency toward instability in slow flight was irrelevant in the high-speed combat regime where Marines now operated. Carrier qualification remained problematic. The Navy continued to view the Corsair as unsuitable for carrier operations due to its poor visibility during landing approaches and its bouncing tendency on touchdown. But Marine squadrons, operating from land bases throughout the Pacific, embraced the aircraft fully. By early 1944, the Corsair equipped most Marine fighter squadrons, and pilots specifically requested assignment to Corsair units rather than squadrons flying other types. The physiological costs of sustained high-speed maneuvering became more apparent as pilots flew increasing numbers of combat sorties. Flight Surgeon Lieutenant Commander Samuel Beeler, stationed at Torokina Airfield on Bougainville in early 1944, examined pilots after missions where they employed rolling escape tactics. His findings documented consistent patterns of physical stress. Nearly every pilot showed facial petechiae, small hemorrhages under the skin caused by rapid blood pressure changes during G transitions. Some exhibited subconjunctival hemorrhages, burst blood vessels in the eyes that created alarming red discoloration, but rarely affected vision permanently. Severe headaches were universal, typically lasting several hours after landing. Several pilots reported temporary balance problems or spatial disorientation that persisted for 30 to 60 minutes post-flight. Beeler's most significant finding involved cumulative effects. Pilots who employed high-G maneuvering tactics repeatedly over weeks or months showed no evidence of permanent physiological damage. The human body appeared capable of adapting to stresses that pre-war aviation medicine had considered unsustainable. Beeler's informal conclusion, never published during wartime, was that the official medical guidance regarding G-force tolerances was overly conservative. Actual combat operations demonstrated that properly conditioned pilots could withstand substantially higher and more varied G-forces than laboratory testing suggested. The psychological adaptation was equally remarkable. First Lieutenant James Sweat, who would earn the Medal of Honor for a single mission in April 1943 where he shot down 7 Japanese aircraft, described his evolving relationship with high-G maneuvering in a post-war interview. "The first time I rolled into one of those spiral dives, I thought I was going to black out or lose the airplane. Everything was spinning and my vision went red and I couldn't tell which way was up. By my 20th or 30th time doing it, it was just another maneuver. Uncomfortable, yes. Disorienting, sure, but manageable. Your body learns what to expect, and you develop techniques to handle it. Sweat's techniques included specific muscle tensing sequences to manage blood flow, breathing patterns timed to G, onset and release, and mental frameworks for maintaining spatial orientation despite confusing visual inputs. These techniques were not taught in any training syllabus. Pilots discovered them individually through experimentation and shared them informally with squadron mates. The collective knowledge of what worked and what didn't accumulated in squadron ready rooms passed from experienced pilots to newcomers as received wisdom. The intensity of combat operations in the Solomon Islands during late 1943 and early 1944 provided constant opportunities to refine and validate these tactics. Daily fighter sweeps, bomber escorts, and combat air patrols generated dozens of engagements where Corsair pilots faced Zeros. The rolling escape maneuver became so routine that after-action reports often described it with minimal detail. Engaged enemy fighters at altitude, employed standard defensive spiral, separated successfully and returned to base. The tactic that had been revolutionary in May had become standard procedure by December. Major Robert Hansen, Kenneth Walsh's former wingman, demonstrated the offensive potential of rolling tactics during his remarkably aggressive tour from November 1943 through February 1944. Hansen shot down 25 Japanese aircraft in 17 combat missions, making him one of the most lethal American fighter pilots on a per-sortie basis. His approach combined textbook energy management with willingness to accept extraordinary risks. Hansen's typical engagement pattern involved diving on Japanese formations from altitude, achieving 1 or 2 kills during the initial pass, then deliberately staying in the combat area rather than disengaging. When Zeros attempted to engage him, Hansen would roll into spiral dives, build speed, then reverse, and climb back into the fight. He repeated this sequence multiple times during single engagements, using the Corsair's energy advantages to dictate combat geometry, despite being numerically outnumbered. On January 14, 1944, Hansen engaged a formation of 20 Zeros near Rabaul with only 3 other Corsairs. During the 30-minute running battle that followed, Hansen shot down 5 Zeros using tactics that horrified more conservative pilots. He deliberately allowed Zeros to achieve tail positions, then rolled away at the last instant before they could fire, built speed separation, then reversed to attack the now disorganized Japanese formation. Other pilots watching from altitude reported that Hansen's Corsair seemed to be everywhere simultaneously, diving, rolling, climbing, always moving with violence and speed that Japanese pilots couldn't match. Hansen was killed in action on February 3, 1944, not because his tactics failed, but because his fuel ran out during an extended combat action. He shot down 4 more Japanese aircraft that day before attempting to return to base with empty tanks. His engine quit short of the airfield. He crashed into the ocean and did not survive. Hansen received the Medal of Honor posthumously. His 25 confirmed victories in just over 2 months of combat operations represented the kind of aggressive lethality that rolling escape tactics enabled. The mathematical reality of combat outcomes demonstrated the effectiveness of these evolved tactics. In the first 6 months of Corsair operations, from February through July 1943, Marine squadrons achieved kill-to-loss ratios of approximately 2-to-1 against Japanese fighters. Respectable, but not overwhelming. From August 1943 through February 1944, after rolling escape tactics had spread throughout Corsair units, the kill ratio improved to approximately 6-to-1. By mid-1944, some squadrons were achieving 10-to-1 or better. These improvements reflected multiple factors, including better maintenance, improved logistics, increasing American pilot experience, and declining Japanese pilot quality. But the tactical innovation of rolling escapes played a significant role. Corsair pilots who would have been shot down in turning engagements survived to fight again. Pilots who survived gained experience. Experienced pilots achieved more kills and mentored newcomers. The positive cycle reinforced itself. Japanese forces attempted to develop aircraft capable of matching American vertical fighting tactics. The Kawanishi N-1K-1J Shiden, introduced in late 1943, featured automatic combat flaps and improved power that gave it better performance in vertical maneuvers than the Zero. The Mitsubishi J-2M Raiden was designed specifically for high-speed interception, with emphasis on climb rate and diving speed. Both aircraft represented improvements over the Zero in the specific performance areas where American fighters held advantages. But these improved Japanese fighters arrived in limited numbers, too late to affect the strategic balance. Production of the Raiden was hampered by manufacturing difficulties and resource shortages. The Raiden suffered from engine reliability problems and restricted forward visibility. Neither aircraft equipped frontline units in significant numbers until mid to late 1944, by which time American air superiority was firmly established. Japanese pilots flying improved fighters still faced overwhelming numerical disadvantages, fuel shortages, and inadequate pilot training that negated whatever tactical advantages their aircraft provided. The Corsair itself underwent continuous improvement throughout the war. The F4U-1A model, introduced in late 1943, featured a raised cockpit that improved forward visibility. The F4U-1D added hardpoints for bombs and rockets, transforming the Corsair into an effective fighter bomber. Later variants improved engine power, increased fuel capacity, and refined control characteristics. But the fundamental airframe remained essentially unchanged from the original F4U-1 because its basic design had proven sound for the combat environment where it operated. By mid-1944, Navy carrier squadrons began accepting the Corsair for shipboard operations. Improved pilot training procedures and modified landing techniques addressed the visibility and bounce problems that had initially prevented carrier qualification. The Royal Navy's Fleet Air Arm had been operating Corsairs from carriers since April 1944, with acceptable accident rates, demonstrating that carrier operations were feasible with appropriate procedures. Navy Corsair squadrons adopted the rolling escape tactics that Marines had developed and refined. Lieutenant Commander Roger Hedrick of VF-84, operating from USS Bunker Hill during the Philippines campaign in late 1944, credited the rolling dive maneuver with saving his life on multiple occasions. Navy pilots added their own refinements based on different operational conditions, but the core tactic remained unchanged. When defensive and below 8,000 feet, roll into a spiral dive, build speed, separate, and reset the engagement. The final accounting of Corsair combat effectiveness revealed an aircraft that achieved exceptional success despite initial operational difficulties. Corsairs shot down 2,140 Japanese aircraft in air-to-air combat against losses of only 189 Corsairs to enemy fighters, an overall kill ratio exceeding 11-1. This ratio surpassed every other American fighter type in the Pacific. Individual Corsair pilots achieved remarkable scores. In addition to Kenneth Walsh and Robert Hansen, Gregory Boyington scored 22 kills in Corsairs. 19 pilots achieved ace status with 10 or more victories. 94 pilots scored 5 or more kills, earning ace recognition. These statistics reflected not just aircraft performance, but the tactical doctrines that evolved through combat experience. The rolling escape maneuver represented only one element of a comprehensive tactical approach, but it was a critical element. It gave Corsair pilots a reliable method for defeating Zero advantages in turning combat. It exploited specific Corsair strengths in ways that official doctrine had not anticipated. Most importantly, it worked, consistently and reliably, which was the only measure that mattered in combat. The legacy of these tactical innovations extended far beyond World War II. The principle that vertical maneuvering could defeat horizontal turning advantages became embedded in fighter tactics doctrine worldwide. Korean war pilots flying F4U Corsairs against North Korean Yak-9 seconds used identical rolling escape techniques. Jet fighters in later conflicts employed spiral dives and high-speed rolling maneuvers as standard defensive tactics. Modern fighter combat training at institutions like the Navy Fighter Weapons School and Air Force Weapons School includes high-G rolling maneuvers as fundamental defensive techniques. The terminology has evolved. Contemporary pilots speak of barrel rolls, high-G barrel rolls, and rolling scissors. But the underlying physics and tactical purpose remain identical to what Kenneth Walsh discovered over the Russell Islands in May 1943. Use three-dimensional maneuvering, exploit your aircraft's specific advantages, and never accept combat on the enemy's terms. The human physiological research that emerged from Corsair operations influenced aviation medicine for decades. The discovery that pilots could sustain repeated high G exposures without permanent damage led to revised G tolerance standards and improved G suit designs. Centrifuge training programs incorporated lessons learned from combat operations, teaching pilots techniques for managing both positive and negative G forces. The specific knowledge of how to execute rolling escape maneuvers has been preserved in the institutional memory of naval aviation. When the Navy re-established adversary squadrons in the 1970s to provide realistic air combat training, the instructors taught rolling defensive tactics using examples drawn directly from World War II Corsair operations. Gun camera footage from Pacific combat was studied by Vietnam-era pilots, learning how previous generations had solved similar tactical problems. Kenneth Walsh survived the war with 21 confirmed victories, and the Medal of Honor awarded for actions on August 15th and 30th, 1943. He remained in the Marine Corps after the war, eventually retiring as a lieutenant colonel. In interviews during the 1980s and 90s, Walsh consistently emphasized that his success resulted not from individual skill, but from learning and applying tactics that other pilots had developed. He credited his survival to the collective knowledge of Marine fighter pilots who shared what worked and discarded what didn't. Walsh described the evolution of rolling escape tactics with characteristic modesty. "We figured out that our airplane was better at some things, and their airplane was better at others. We tried to fight using our strengths instead of accepting combat where they were stronger. The rolling dive worked because it used what the Corsair did well: roll fast and dive fast against what the Zero couldn't do: follow at high speed. Simple physics, really, but it took getting shot at to figure it out." The story of Corsair pilots developing and employing rolling escape tactics represents a broader pattern in military history. Formal doctrine, developed in peacetime or based on limited combat experience, often proves inadequate when confronted with actual battlefield conditions. Combat forces adapt by developing informal solutions that address specific problems their doctrine did not anticipate. These innovations spread through unofficial channels, tested and refined by the people whose lives depend on their effectiveness. The organizational challenge involves recognizing valuable innovation, documenting it appropriately, and incorporating it into formal training without bureaucratic delays that make the knowledge irrelevant. The Marine Corps eventually succeeded in this process with Corsair tactics, but only after months of combat operations had already validated what pilots had discovered independently. The technological lesson is that aircraft performance characteristics matter less than how intelligently pilots employ those characteristics. The Corsair was not aerodynamically superior to the Zero in most measurable parameters. It turned wider, climbed slower at low speeds, and required more skill to fly safely. But Marine pilots identified the specific areas where the Corsair excelled, developed tactics that exploited those advantages, and achieved overwhelming success against an opponent flying an aircraft optimized for different combat geometry. The human lesson is that physiological and psychological limits are not fixed boundaries, but rather dynamic thresholds that can be expanded through training, experience, and necessity. Pre-war aviation medicine insisted that negative G forces and high G rolling maneuvers were intolerable. Combat pilots proved otherwise, not because the science was wrong, but because the testing conditions had not replicated actual combat stress, where tolerating temporary discomfort meant survival. The final measure of any tactical innovation is simply whether it works. Rolling escape tactics worked. Pilots who employed them survived encounters that would otherwise have been fatal. Pilots who survived flew more missions, gained more experience, and achieved more victories. The cumulative effect transformed the Corsair from a difficult, dangerous aircraft with a poor reputation into one of history's most successful fighter designs. When the war ended in August 1945, Corsair production continued because the aircraft had proven its worth so decisively. The F4U remained in frontline service through the Korean War and continued flying with smaller air forces into the 1960s. No other American World War II fighter enjoyed such extended operational life. The Corsair's longevity reflected not just sound engineering, but the tactical doctrines that had evolved to employ the aircraft effectively. The pilots who flew Corsairs in combat carried knowledge that could not be fully captured in training manuals or official reports. They understood intuitively how their aircraft responded under extreme conditions, because they had explored those conditions under circumstances where mistakes meant death. They knew precisely how much altitude a rolling dive consumed, because they had counted the feet while watching altimeters unwind. They knew exactly how their vision would degrade during negative G phases, because they had experienced that degradation while simultaneously trying to evade an enemy, attempting to kill them. This knowledge, built incrementally through hundreds of combat engagements, represented the true innovation. Not the aircraft itself, though it was well designed, not any single maneuver, though the rolling escape was tactically significant. The innovation was the collective understanding of how to fight effectively in three-dimensional space against a skilled opponent using physics, not just courage, to achieve victory. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.